Hello, hello? Hello? Let's try and turn up the volume. All right. Let's go ahead and get started for today. It's a little loud, sorry. All right. Hopefully that volume's okay. I'm Dr. Mo Turner, so I'll be filling in for Dr. Theobald today for our lecture. Thank you. Very excited to be here. I will say, I'll just take a moment, it is wildly intimidating to have this many people staring at you all at once. So just props to Dr. Theobald for doing that every day. But I am really excited to be talking to you today. In particular, I sort of lucked out with this lecture because we're going to be thinking a lot about primary productivity in the ocean. And I'm actually a marine ecologist, so the ocean is sort of my forte. It's what I'm really excited about. So I'm glad that this is the lecture that I get to work on today with you. So for today's lecture, we're going to be thinking about, so let's start with yesterday. Yesterday, we thought about different types of populations and how populations are interacting with each other. Today, we're going to take a step back and sort of zoom at an even larger picture and think about not just how populations are interacting with each other, but how nutrients and how energy is flowing within an entire ecosystem. So by the end of this lecture, we should be able to analyze the different constraints on productivity. We'd like to analyze how humans are impacting productivity. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the nitrogen cycle. And then finally, we're going to take a look at how energy is flowing into and out of a system. Before I get into the actual content, I do want to give a small content warning for a little bit later in the lecture. When we see this graph again, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about events around World War I and World War II, and also an instance of suicide. Those are very heavy topics. If you are uncomfortable at any time, feel free to step out. Of course, like all of the lectures, this is being recorded, so you're welcome to return back to it in your own time, in your own space, to be able to listen to the recording and get some of the content from it. But do feel free to step out if you feel that's necessary. Okay, so we've seen this graph before, thinking about MPP in different systems. There we go. We've mostly focused on terrestrial systems so far in our lectures. In thinking about the total amount of primary production in a system, we see that the greatest amount of total MPP is coming from tropical wet forests and also the ocean. And today I really want to think about that primary productivity that's occurring in the ocean. Even though this graph looks a little funky, sort of if we turn our head to the side, you'll see that it's just a normal bar graph that we've seen a bunch of times, right? So each of these bars is telling us some variation between all of these different habitats. But what about the variation within a single habitat? So within the open ocean, right, there is variation. And so let's take a look at what that looks like. So here we're seeing that same data that you just saw, but now it's on a color-coded map of the globe. And so these warmer colors up here means more productivity, the cooler colors is less. There's two main conclusions that I hope you take away from this particular chart. The first is that NPP per kilometer squared is higher on land than in the ocean, right? We've talked about this a little bit before with that previous graph. Per kilometer squared, plants are producing more MPP than in the ocean. But the ocean is still producing a lot just because it covers so much space. So small amounts of MPP over a large amount of space versus on land, a lot of MPP over a small amount of space. The second thing to walk away with here in thinking about the oceans is that the highest amount of primary productivity is occurring along the coastlines. So of every single continent, I know it kind of can be a little hard to see, but right along the edges of all of these continents, you see lighter color, that warmer color, indicating that we have higher primary productivity along those coasts. And the question is, why? Why do we see so much of the primary productivity that's happening in the ocean along those coastlines? So I've got a couple questions for you to start thinking about how to answer this. The first thing to think about is, what do primary producers need? We've talked about this in terrestrial systems, in marine systems. The mechanisms are the same, right? We're still doing photosynthesis. So what do primary producers need? And then second, as we're thinking about water depth, where do we see the highest amount of light availability? With those two answers, hopefully we can sort of merge them together to get back at this original question: why is primary productivity highest in the ocean along coastlines? So talk with a partner next to you, grab a TA if you need some help. Spend about a minute working through these questions. Okay. All right, let's come back together. I'll take any volunteers for the first two questions. You can answer either one, either of the first two questions. Any volunteers? Yeah, go ahead. Light, yeah, light is one that primary producers need. So sunlight, let's see. Sunlight. What else do primary producers need? Yeah. Water. We're already in the ocean, so I'm going to count that as definitely something that's happening. What's another thing? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Nutrients. Yes. And what are our two limiting nutrients? Anyone can shout it out. Nitrogen and phosphorus. Yeah, we've got two major limiting resources. These same requirements for our land producers are the same requirements that our ocean primary producers need as well. How about the second question? Who would like to tell me what you and your partners talked about? Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely. So we're seeing more light availability in the shallow areas. Oh man. What? Okay. Shallow waters. What on earth? Okay. Shallow waters. Right? So as the water is getting shallower and shallower and shallower, eventually it becomes land. Right? So the shallower it is, the more light availability you're getting in the water. And then lastly, who would like to try and put these two things together to talk about why the coastlines see the highest amount of primary productivity? All the way in the back with the hat. Yeah, perfect. Yes, beautiful. So she was saying that as we get shallower and shallower and shallower, we get more and more sunlight, which is one of our limiting factors. And then also, there's a phenomenon known as upwelling, which I'll talk about in just a second. But that phenomenon is bringing nutrients from deeper, colder waters up towards the surface, and that happens along coastlines. Can anyone else think of why we see lots of nutrients happening at the coastline? There's another really big one, another really big reason. Go ahead. Yeah, there's more organisms along coastlines, so as they die, those nutrients are cycling right along the coastlines. Does anyone have another one? Yeah. Absolutely. So runoff from rivers. So as rivers are running along the land, they're picking up all kinds of material, organic material, organisms, nutrients. They're picking all of that up and carrying it with them to the ocean and dumping it out. So where the ocean meets the rivers, you get massive amounts of nutrients entering oceans. And then, as we already mentioned before, upwelling is a second major natural process to bring these sort of colder, deeper, nutrient-rich waters up towards the surface. There's not a lot you need to actually know about how upwelling works. The major takeaway here is just that the nutrient water is much deeper, and the reason why we're seeing that is that any organisms living either in open ocean or along the coast, when they die, they sink to the bottom. When they sink to the bottom, decomposers start to break them down, and so you get this accumulation of nutrients in these deep waters where the decomposers are breaking it down. And then when that upwelling occurs, that water sort of follows the coastline up towards the surface, and now that nutrient-rich water comes up to where sunlight is available, and the combination of those two things will increase your NPP. Really nicely done. So let's think a little bit more about nitrogen as a limiting resource. So our air, our atmosphere, is actually made up of roughly, I believe it's closer to 77% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So if that much of our nitrogen, if the vast majority of it is nitrogen, how is anything nitrogen limited if there's so much? The short answer to that is something called nitrogen fixing. What I'd like for you to do is talk with the person next to you and think through both of these questions. Why is anything nitrogen limited, and what is nitrogen fixing? So take a moment, grab a TA if you need one. All right, there was sort of a natural die down of volume, so let's come back together. I'll take any volunteers for either of these. Why would anything be nitrogen limited? Yeah, go ahead.
Because atmospheric nitrogen, N2, is triple bonded together, and that's not fun to break.
Atmospheric nitrogen is triple bonded, so it is really, really hard to break that apart, and most organisms cannot do that. We refer to that as, I'm going to call that relatively inert. inert, also known as chemically inactive. Organisms, we can breathe it into our lungs, but we have no way of breaking up that nitrogen so that we can actually use it. So this is inaccessible nitrogen, and most of the nitrogen is in this form. So then the question is, what does nitrogen fixing mean? How do we break those bonds? Any takers on the second question? What is nitrogen fixing? Not sure. Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely. So nitrogen fixing is a term that we use to describe the transformation of this relatively inert form of nitrogen into these biologically accessible forms. These forms of nitrogen can be taken into body tissue of a much more vast group of organisms, and this is how we're able to incorporate it into plant growth, into animal growth, anything like that. And the vast majority, actually almost exclusively, nitrogen fixing is happening via microbes and through fungi. There's pretty much no other animals that can do nitrogen fixing. So we really heavily rely on these organisms to break down that inert nitrogen into a form that all other life can use to grow. This same biologically accessible nitrogen is what we use for fertilizers. So when you're adding fertilizers to plants, what you're actually adding is biologically accessible nitrogen, phosphorus, and sometimes potassium. This particular example here, you can see these numbers, 10, 15, 10. That's telling you the amount of each of those elements that it's adding to your plant life, to your plants. And we're now able to commercially make this, to synthetically make fertilizer and add that to our plants. And hopefully that starts to get you thinking about, ooh, interesting, if we're able to add nitrogen, what kind of consequences might that lead to later down the road? And we'll talk about that. This is one example of adding nutrients, human-made nutrients, to a system. There's another common way of doing this, and that's through feces, whether that's other animals or humans. And the reason why feces can be used as a type of fertilizer is because we don't extract all nutrients out of food when we eat it. We extract only some of it. Some of it is excreted out of organisms. In addition, we have our own set of microbes, our microbiome, inside of our gut, particularly in the large intestine. So your food hits your small intestine first, you absorb all the nutrients you can. What's left goes to the large intestine where your microbes continue to break down that food into more biologically available nutrients, and then that gets excreted out as well. So we can use those nutrients as fertilizers. So both examples of adding nitrogen to a system. For today, we're really going to focus mostly on this particular process. So where do we get this nitrogen? How did we start synthesizing nitrogen? And the answer is through a process known as the Haber process. This was created in 1910 by a scientist called Fritz Haber. And he used hydrogen gas and energy. So energy, we're thinking about high pressure and high temperatures to create ammonia, to turn an inert form of nitrogen into a biologically active form of nitrogen. A year later, a second scientist helped him ramp up the production of this commercially. So his name was Bosch. So this is now actually referred to as the Haber-Bosch process of making nitrogen. And in doing this, we estimate now that we have roughly doubled the nitrogen fixation rate across the globe. So instead of waiting for microbes, right, instead of me going out to my garden and waiting for all the fungi to break down the nitrogen in my garden, I can just throw nitrogen out there that we have synthetically created. So again, we're starting to think about the human impacts on the nitrogen cycle itself. So in this graph here, we're looking at corn yield in the United States over time. So we've got yield here, we've got time heading across, and we can see this increase in yield happening. So, I think I might have already said this, but I'll let you think about it anyway. The Haber process was invented in Germany, and given this graph, when do you think that might have occurred? Talk to the person next to you real quick, just for a second, knowing that if it's in Germany, there might have been a delay before it got to the US. All right. Hopefully we guessed sometime before the amount of yield started spiking up, right? Haber-Bosch process was invented in about 1910, ramped up in 1911, and then we see this absolutely incredible increase in the amount of food that we're able to produce. In fact, it's estimated right now that 48% of the nitrogen that feeds humans is from this process. So as you're thinking about that number, right, almost 50% of the food that we eat is from this process. You should be thinking about human growth, carrying capacity, impacts on using this type of thing on a global scale. If we think back to yesterday's lecture, would this suggest that humans are are being controlled by bottom-up processes or top-down processes? Yeah, totally, I agree. Bottom-up processes for sure. As soon as we sort of started growing more food, that could potentially increase the carrying capacity of humans. Just a reminder again, now that we're back to this chart, science doesn't happen just in a bubble, right? It's always happening in some sort of social context. And when this was first invented, this was around the same time that World War I was starting to ramp up. And so I think it's really important that we think about how this process was occurring, how society responded to it at the same time, and not just acknowledge the amazing science that these folks did, but also understand the societal context that it came in. So if we think through this, sort of a timeline of what occurred, in 1909, Haber created this process. In 1910, or somewhere around there, 1910, 1911, it was scaled up. In 1914, the British created a blockade that prevented ships going from Chile to Germany, and this essentially cut off their supply of nitrogen, of natural, biologically accessible nitrogen. And what that did was cut off growing food supply for the country. It actually cut off a lot of their munitions, so a lot of explosives require nitrogen. And so Haber used his process to start growing more food for the country and also start providing biologically accessible nitrogen for explosives. In addition, in 1915, Haber slightly tweaked his recipe and substituted in chlorine, and with that created the first chemical bomb that was used in warfare. So he is also considered, one of his monikers is the father of chemical warfare, using the same process that he had used to increase the amount of food that was available for people. In 1915, Haber's wife, who was also a chemist, also very renowned for her work, was sort of struggling so much with the implications of using this process for so much good to feed their country, but also so much bad for killing so many people, that she ended up taking her own life. In 1918, Haber and Bosch won the Nobel Prize for the fertilizer use, for the use of fertilizer to create more food. In 1933, Haber, who was Jewish, started recognizing the signs of nationalism growing in Germany and decided to flee the country. Unfortunately, he had inadvertently already given them another weapon to use. He had created an insecticide in 1917 known as Zyklon B, and this was used in World War II in concentration camps, in death camps, which then also prompted many, many additional deaths. So this is very heavy. There's a lot going on. This is really complicated, right? So what I'd like for you to do, take a moment if you need to, talk to the person next to each other, check in, talk about your thoughts on this, and particularly I'd like you to think about this Nobel Prize that they won for this process. So take a moment, talk to each other, grab a TA if you need one. All right, let's come back together. I really appreciate you engaging in this type of discussion. I think it's really important that we recognize how science is playing a role in society as well as what it's actually doing. A lot of the things that you felt, a lot of the things that you heard were also felt and heard at the same time. There was a large movement of people who proposed that the Nobel Prize be revoked from these scientists for the other processes that occurred because of this one. There were also a lot of scientists who proposed to just sort of keep blinders on and just recognize the great science that it really was. And the ability for this fertilizer to truly increase the amount of food that's available, regardless of the other consequences that came from it. So it can be really, really complicated to think of. And again, thank you for discussing that with me. So let's take a step back again and let's think about this nitrogen. Let's bring it back to thinking about the ocean. So we know that we were increasing yields of plants, of our food, right? And if we're thinking about how nitrogen reaches the ocean, one of those things we talked about was river runoff. So if we're starting to throw more and more fertilizer out onto the land, Any sort of rain, any sort of irrigation is going to carry that extra new nitrogen, biologically accessible nitrogen, to the ocean. So we've got more nutrients coming into the coastline, which should lead to even higher NPP. And that should be a good thing, right? If we think all the way back to our feedback loops, right? If climate change is increasing NPP, right? We talked about this on the worksheet briefly. If climate change is increasing NPP, NPP should be drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, reducing climate change, right? So we've got a negative feedback loop happening. So that should be a good thing. But we have an unintended consequence that also occurs, which is referred to as a dead zone. As we add more nutrients to the coastline and have higher NPP, we also see bigger and more severe dead zones occurring at the coastline. And my question for you are, what are dead zones? And then why are they occurring more and more severely along our coastlines? Take a moment, talk with your neighbor about these two questions, and we'll check back in. Grab a TA if you need one. All right. I'll take any volunteers. Yes, go ahead. Beautiful. Dead zones are where we have reduced oxygen in the water. Where's the pen? There it is. Reduced oxygen in the water. So if we have reduced available oxygen, then anything that needs to use that oxygen in the water to breathe then dies off. Why are we seeing these more at coastlines? I'll take a new hand. Anybody? Yes. Yeah, algal blooms. Beautiful. So here's an example. Let's walk through one of the larger dead zones that we have off the coast of the United States. So here we have the Gulf of Mexico down here. This particular dead zone is called the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico. So nitrate, which is derived from our ammonia-based fertilizer that we are creating, on any of the farms within this shaded zone, if that runs off into any of the rivers, all of those rivers feed into the Mississippi, running down the center of the United States. All of the nutrients along all of those farms run into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi spits them all out along the coast of Louisiana. And so, in response, we get a huge burst of primary productivity, right? If nitrogen was that limiting factor, if phosphorus was that limiting factor, suddenly there's a huge abundance of it. So you have this huge burst of primary productivity. A lot of times we call these algal blooms. These blooms then die off, and in the ocean when things die, they sink. So we sink down to the bottom. Hopefully this process is looking familiar to something we talked about earlier. Decomposers start to break that down. However, while decomposers are breaking that down, they're also respiring, right? They're breathing in and out. They're using oxygen from the water, and they're using it all up. So all of the oxygen starts to decrease in the water, and anything that needs to use that to breathe dies. And so what we can end up with are these huge areas of water where fish and other organisms start floating up to the top because they have run out of oxygen in the water. In 2017, the Gulf of Mexico experienced one of the largest dead zones on record so far, when we started recording in 1985. This dead zone spanned almost 9,000 square miles. That's roughly the size of New Jersey. Was water that was completely devoid of oxygen. Huge dead zones where nothing could live. So this is one of those consequences of humans impacting this nitrogen cycle along oceans. The Mississippi is not that close to here, so here's a more local example of one of these processes happening. So on the map, here's UW over here, off to the corner here. If you've ever been to Discovery Park, it's lovely. Right at the tip of Discovery Park, there's a nice big water treatment plant. In 2017, we had really, really heavy rains, and the amount of water that entered this treatment plant actually crippled it. And it ended up flooding and spilling out a lot of raw human sewage into the Puget Sound. So given what we've talked about, what would you expect would have happened around this same period of time? Talk to your neighbor real quick. What would we expect to see given this scenario? All right, I know that was a little bit of a short one. I'll take any volunteers. What did we think we would see after sewage spilled into the Puget Sound? I'll take a new hand. New hands. Any guesses? Anyone from the balcony? I haven't heard from y'all today. Balcony folks, any takers? Ooh, I see a hand back here. Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely, I agree. So we wouldn't see something to the scale of what's happening along the Mississippi, right? Because that's a huge river system, tons of nutrients. But as we mentioned earlier in the lecture, feces also has lots of biologically accessible nutrients in it. So similar to fertilizer running into the water, feces running into the water is going to result in a really similar a really similar scenario where you have a quick boom of phytoplankton who are taking advantage of all those nutrients. They sink to the bottom, decomposers eat it all up, use up all the oxygen, and we ended up with a small sort of temporary dead zone for a little bit. All right, let's switch gears really quick. I know this feels like a bit of a jump, but so far we've been thinking about photosynthesizers, primary producers, and how the flow of nutrients affects what they're doing. Now I'd like us to think about the primary producers and the flow of their energy into the rest of the ecosystem. So we're going to use this example here from the Hubbard Brook Forest. This is a forest that was, in 1955, was designated as a research center. So since then, this particular forest has basically been observed in every way you could possibly think of. And a whole network of scientists collect constant data from this forest to try and understand a whole variety of things going on, from stream dynamics to growth, primary productivity, all these different types of aspects. So for here, what we're going to look at is the flow of energy. So they predicted that in this forest, about 1.25 million kcals per meter squared per year of sunlight was coming down onto this forest, was available to this forest. Of that sunlight, about 10,000 kcals per meter squared per year was actually being captured by photosynthesis. So roughly 1% of sunlight was actually being captured. Of that energy, 4,500 or so was being used for growth and reproduction, whereas 5,500 or so was being used for respiration and maintenance. Of that growth and reproduction, about 1,100 was being eaten by consumers, and the other 3,400 were being decomposed by decomposers. So I have a polling question for you, and I want you to try and answer on your own first. And my question is, of these numbers available to you, which one represents the GPP of this forest, and which one represents the NPP? Here are your options. The first letter will represent GPP, the second letter should represent NPP. Which combination in the correct order is the right answer? All right, I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Talk to your partner sitting next to you and re-poll in. All right. I'll take any volunteers. What did you and your partner discuss? Which one is GPP and which one is NPP? Oh, hand in the balcony, yes. Say that one more time. Yes, so GPP is B. Nicely done. GPP is B. And that's because it's the amount of total energy that the forest is gathering, right? This is the amount of total energy available to them, but this is how much they're actually getting of that energy. Someone else want to take NPP? Which number would be NPP? Yeah, go ahead. Yep. C becomes NPP. Why is that the case? Why did you pick C?
Because that's like the 4,514 kilocalories is what was actually being used for the growth of the
Absolutely. So this 4,500 kcalorie per meter squared per year is the actual energy that's being put towards growth, right? That doesn't include the energy that was used for respiration or maintenance. This is just the energy going towards growth. Yeah, go ahead, Ernest. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. So we've talked in the past, we've talked about how growth is NPP and that reproduction under our previous definition would belong on the other side, right? This would be respiration, maintenance, and reproduction. In this case, this is how these scientists decided to group the numbers instead, likely because it was an easier way to gather those numbers. It's a great question. All right. So, I won't pose this just for the sake of time, but in this ecosystem, the percentage of MPP that's getting eaten by consumers, the way we could calculate that is out of the 4,514 units of energy being used for growth, 1,000 of them is being eaten by consumers. And that comes out to roughly 25%. So 25% of the energy of this growth is actually being eaten by the consumers. All right, so let's run through a really quick problem here, thinking about the efficiency of energy transfer through different trophic levels. So if this forest only gathers about 1% of the sunlight available to them, let's start out our primary producer with about 1,000 grams of biomass. Then our primary producer would end up at about 200 grams. Our next consumer that eats the primary consumer would be 30 grams, and the tertiary consumer would end up with 3. So work with your partners real quick for just a minute or two and work out how efficient is the energy transfer from one level to the next. Go ahead and work together. How would you do that math? All right, I know this is quick because I only have about a minute left. Let's come back together real quick. Hopefully this is something similar that you saw. The big takeaway here is that the amount of energy moving from one trophic layer to another is relatively small. We actually refer to this as the 10% rule. Roughly only 10% of the energy makes it to the next trophic level. This is a series of questions that you and your study partners can go through thinking about this energy process. Real quick, the last thing I want to add, I'm going to sort of flip through some of this. I added a supplemental article onto our under the lectures on Canvas. This is a particularly interesting article. It's asking why are blue whales so big? And using the concepts that you learned today, you can try and get at some of the major hypotheses about why this is the case. This article also addresses a ton of other of our huge concepts that we've been thinking about. So I would suggest you look through this with your study group and highlight where those terms are being used and understanding the concept of it. All right, thank y'all. Gather your exams from your TAs. I'll see you next week. Oh, thanks. Jesus.